Okay, some final thoughts, concluding thoughts on Alistair McIntyre's After Virtue. Rather than summing up the last chapter, I thought I would try to do something else. I want to think about on a much more practical level how all this book actually affects the way you live your life and how you think about yourself in light of God and the mandates he's placed upon you. I'd like to begin by putting up two tropes or two ideals or two axes upon which you can imagine the world operating between. Now, the fact of the matter is these are like caricatures rather than real people. Most of us operate somewhere in the middle on the spectrum or partake of one or the other, maybe in some even incoherent way that's not inconsistent. But these are two ideals. One, and it's about ethics and behavior and morality. Why do we follow God? Let me offer two reasons why we follow God. And it goes something like this. On the one hand, there's something called obedience through divine fiat. I'll explain what that is in a minute. On the other hand, there's what Alistair McIntyre describes, which is virtue ethics. Okay, ethics through divine fiat versus virtue ethics, Alistair McIntyre stuff. Let me first describe what I mean by virtue, or obedience or ethics through divine fiat. When I say divine fiat, fiat means God just says it, like the divine fiat, the king's fiat, a monarchical fiat, like law by will, law by declaration. It is good because the king says so. For example, on Monday, if God says jump, my response is how high? Okay, I don't ask God why I should jump. I just jump. If the following Tuesday God says duck, my response is how low, God? And I go down immediately. I don't ask God why should I jump? What is the reason for my jumping? What is behind the jumping? Should I jump? What is the nature of jumping? I say, yeah, I'll jump. You just do what you're told to do, and you trust that God is behind it all, and he makes it right. It's not up to you to understand why God wants to do something. Let me give you an example. God says, thou shalt don't lie, kill, or steal, all right? God says, don't lie, kill, or steal. Why shouldn't I lie, kill, or steal? I don't know, okay? I just don't lie, kill, or steal. I could think about it, but that's not really the reason. The reason why I don't lie, kill, or steal is because God says so. Now, I can imagine after the fact why that's the case, but that's not the point, though. My obedience is not contingent on my understanding or God explaining things to me. I just do it. That's ethics by divine fiat. God just declares it to be so. One really good example of this will be Kierkegaard, and we talked about Kierkegaard and read about Kierkegaard a little bit. Now, Kierkegaard, in a really famous book, describes at length Abraham being called to sacrifice Isaac. And this is a really good example of divine fiat. Abraham just had to do it. He didn't understand it. It made absolutely no sense to him. It was beyond his reason. But Abraham's obedience was not contingent on any of this stuff making sense. He just did it. This is ethics. This is ethics by divine fiat. Now, that's a whole tricky issue that I need to explain about that, but just one example Kierkegaard used to explain this kind of ethics. That's one example. The other pole is what Alistair McIntyre is describing, which is virtue ethics. And the idea is this: you certainly obey God, but the idea is that I will study God, understand the nature of God, understand the nature of that ethics, and then I will internalize it. So another way of imagining this is virtue by habituation. I'm not obeying simply because I'm going down the do, don't list, although that's certainly part of it, but rather I've been reared, nurtured, and I fully absorbed and been trained in the nature of virtue. So then my obedience to God is certainly, on one hand, following rules, but it's more of like a natural emanation of that in which I've been formed and shaped. There's another example of, virtue ethics also implies this deep understanding of the nature of God, the mind of God, the heart of God, through conversations with other wise, virtuous people, and discussion with the past, and discussion of history. So that thing has been fully absorbed in me. So there's certainly there's certainly the nature of obedience by law, but it's really not about obedience by law. It's really more like I've been shaped and thus I follow out of my shaping of the way it's been made to me. Let me give you another example of how this might work out, just an analogy. I could memorize the entire multiplication table. You know that graph you often get in elementary school? I can memorize the entire multiplication table. And if you were to test me on the entire multiplication table, I would get 100%. I've just memorized it. However, it's possible for me to memorize the entire multiplication table, but never understand anything about multiplication, never understand the nature of multiplication. That's entirely theoretically possible. On the other hand, I could be, okay, and that would be like ethics by divine fiat. You just memorize and do with no understanding. A certain kind of brute obedience. On the other hand, I could just not actually memorize the multiplication table. I could just memorize a smattering of maybe 30% of it, right? I could just memorize 30% of the multiplication table. On the other hand, though, what I've done is I've really understood the nature of multiplication. So when I'm given that test, I will also get 100%. Not because I've memorized all the answers, but I understand the nature of it. And so I can actually do the questions I know ahead of time. But then I'm going to encounter a multiplication problem that I've never memorized. I don't know. It's utterly unfamiliar. It's utterly baffling to me. But because I understand the way multiplication works, I can derive the proper answer, even though I've never seen the problem before, that particular problem, because I understand the nature of it. Okay? So I think the analogy to spell further out is so we have just basic principles of like how to follow God, the nature of God, the nature of the laws. But then as we go along through history in our lives, we're going to run into weird problems that we've never seen before, that they're utterly historically unprecedented. For example, bioethics, we brought that up before, or how do you handle massive economic global policies? There's nothing in the Bible particularly about those kinds of issues that are new and innovative. So the idea is, I mean, if you just said, I'm going to memorize the laws, well, the law doesn't appeal to talk about this. But rather what you then say is, well, let's use our wisdom. Let's use the way we can shape our understanding of the laws of God, the nature of God, the will of God. And then from that, try to derive what we hope is the best and right answer. I think both are valid. Okay, it's not like one is wrong and one is right. One might be more useful than the other. The problem with obedience through or ethics through divine fiat is almost obvious. It's rather obvious in that you just might run into problems you don't know much about, and your kind of biblical literalism might be limited. Okay, that's a problem. The problem with this idea of the virtue ethics, where that falls short, is every now and then you might feel called by God to do something that makes no sense whatsoever. And there's this idea then that, like the obedience to God is then contingent on me understanding it, or like my assent to it. But what if you don't understand it? What if you don't assent to it? Now, I do not think any of you will ever be called to sacrifice your child to God like Abraham and Isaac. That's a very exceptional situation. However, there might be things that are analogous to that, right? I mean, sometimes following God makes no sense. Sometimes you have everything to lose and nothing to gain, and it doesn't appear that anything's happening. I can imagine like missionary stories I've heard where it appears that they're just slogging away on the mission field, and they feel profoundly called by God to be missionaries in some particular area, and it makes absolutely no sense. Then I've heard stories about later on after their death, or their circumstances way beyond their realm of cognition, where it actually was profoundly profitable for them to be there. Things really happened, but they didn't see it. Or it could be that we will never understand why God has called us to do anything. It could be that very much we are called to obedience. It doesn't have to be some strange hocus pocus or really over the top strange, but you're just called simple obedience, and it doesn't appear that it makes any sense. It doesn't appear that there's any profit from this. It doesn't appear that anyone even acknowledges or knows what you're doing. And yet, so on a logical level, it makes no sense, right? And yet, nonetheless, we're called by God to be obedient, kind of like by divine fiat. It's not contingent on your understanding these things. I want to make one more comment about fiat versus virtue. And these are just tendencies. It's not completely 100% true. I think they're just tendencies. I think Protestants tend to veer towards divine fiat. I think Catholics tend to verge towards, lean into the virtue stuff. And there's a theological, philosophical, historical reason why. Catholics have been, because of their history, they've been much more at ease with interacting with secular, non-Christian pagan philosophy. For example, they like Aristotle. They think that God's grace has been upon Aristotle. Now, he's not saved. He's not fully in the grace of God. But God's the natural theology, the natural knowledge of Aristotle is useful for the Catholic, for the Christian mind in general. Also, they have a higher view of human nature. They believe the fall wrecked creation and wrecked human nature, but they have a higher understanding of the remaining nature, divine image in humanity. Pagans are still wise. Christians, even in their fallen state, still have a lot of knowledge, a lot of useful knowledge. There's something redemptive even in their fallen state. Okay, that's a Catholic view. Thus, it would make sense that they would understand virtue ethics, this idea that we have to understand God, and we can understand God. We ought to understand God. The Protestant Reformation, among many other things, has a lower view of human nature. They think that when Adam and Eve fell, they really fell hard. A lot of this has Luther's worm theology. We're broken people. Creation is really fallen. The human nature is really fallen. It's a matter of degrees. Catholic view, fallen. Protestant view, much more fallen. Protestants have a lower view of the utility or the redemptive nature of pagan thoughts. Again, this has a lot to do with history. Luther, among other people, were really skeptical or frustrated with Catholic views of scholastic theology. Their use of pagan philosophy to make their theology very complicated and much to work out issues. Luther had a much more biblicist views. It's a bit of a caricature, but their idea was it's just the Bible. We don't need all these other philosophical ideas, and that gets us in weird places like purgatory and buying your way out of purgatory, that sort of thing. And so again, I mean, for obvious reasons just spelled out, I think the Catholics are more comfortable with virtue ethics. The Protestants are much more comfortable with ethics by divine fiat. It's not completely true that Catholics only have this side and Protestants only have this side. It's just a question of where your theological tradition makes you more comfortable. All right. Okay. So that's, I mean, I didn't want to talk about the very last chapter. I could, I suppose, but I thought it was pretty short, pretty self-explanatory. And I don't think you really need me to explain it line by as I did the others. But I just want to give you some more thoughts about how does this book actually, in some practical way, affect the way you go through life. Okay. All right. Thanks.